Hello, I'm Megan Van Emmen, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with Montana State University. This webinar is going to be about selectively culling your beef herd and record keeping. When we're thinking about selective culling, no matter what year it is, whether it's in a drought year, a good year, or you're just making those regular culling decisions, there's a few tips that you can keep in mind as you're trying to make those assessments. So the first being, what are your production goals? Setting and evaluating your production goals on a yearly basis can help you reach your potential as a producer in your beef herd's reproductive capabilities, your genetics, and their performance. And performance can be whatever that production goal is. Are you raising bulls for potential sale? Are you raising steers to be sold at weaning, or is your aim to develop successful replacements in your herd? Now, the biggest thing is to assess your herd. Be very critical in your assessment. Keeping those production goals in mind, making a list of those animals that may have not met their production goals or their genetic potential, or making a list of those animals that are highly successful within your herd. This could be an example of, let's say you have a 10-year-old cow that every year she gets bred. She has a calf in the first cycle every calving season. That calf performs well through to weaning, and at weaning you are either selling that steer calf to a feedlot, or you have developed enough heifers from that cow that you're maintaining those genetics. So that would be a success for that herd if those are your production goals. Now, if you have, let's say, a younger cow, let's say 4 or 5 years old, and she struggles to get bred every year, she's in the second or third breeding cycles and calves late, therefore she's struggling to get bred, and then those calves are light at weaning compared to her herd mates. Maybe she has had some heifers and those are within the herd, but keeping then that list of animals from her in your herd, and are they also struggling to get bred every year? Or does she have lightweight steer calves every year? So that may be an animal you may want to consider culling, even though she is a young animal. So keeping that in mind as you're assessing your herd and making those critical decisions, it can be crucial to make a cull priority list, and that is mainly due to what your production goals are. So making that list of what to cull, whether it's cows, bulls, heifers, or steers, sometimes if you want to keep some steers back to feed out yourself, or if you have steers that don't fit in that uniform group as you're selling at the auction market, or if you go direct to an order buyer, you may end up having to keep those steers that may not meet the goals of your order buyer or the auction market or the group that you've put forth to sell. Now, I know it's difficult to make that list to cull because, as many have, there's always producers that have those favorite cows, that they look really good, but that's where you have to critically assess your herd. Are those favorite cows actually producing the animals you need for your herd? The same with your bulls. Are the bulls, 5 and 6 years old, where they have probably met their potential for your herd because you have now improved your genetic base in your herd, and are those bulls out of date on their genetics? Should they be culled to make way for a new set of bulls to come in with a better set of genetics to help you improve upon your production goals? Heifers, making those selections early at weaning, there are several factors you could look at, such as structure, their cow performance as well. Making those heifer selections early on can help reduce the amount of feed you would put into those heifers throughout the year, as you prepare for the breeding season the following year. So, having those heifers that aren't going to reach your potential for your cow herd and culling those early because they may meet someone else's production goals. So, one thing to keep in mind as well with heifers is that not all heifers are deemed to meet the requirements as a replacement heifer. Some heifers should enter the feedlot and become harvested animals. You know, not all heifers are made to be breeding replacements. And then if you have a multiple outlet situation, you can determine where each group of your animals is sold. You can create groups to better meet the market demands that might be in your area. So as we're thinking about our selective culling and our list that we're making and writing down, there's some easy things we can define, and then there's some not so easy things to define when we are looking at culling. So number one is pretty easy, production issues. Are they old? Do they have bad feet, teeth, or udder issues? Were they open after the breeding season? Or were those cows or those heifers producing a low quality calf? Are they thin animals? Now, sometimes you have cows that are thin, but they produce a good calf every year. We talk about body condition score a lot when we're thinking about rebreeding and the potential to produce colostrum quality. There are always going to be some thinner cows in your herd, no matter how much you feed them, if you separate them off and try to put more weight on them. So determining body condition score can be critical in making these culling decisions, because the thin cows that I'm describing here are those cows that have lost a lot of body condition, maybe due to age or other factors, but that body condition is detrimental to their calf production. So just because you have some thin cows doesn't necessarily mean that you should cull specifically on that. You need to look at all these other factors to make those decisions. Now, the third being for production issues, late breds. You know, do you have a 45 to 60 day breeding window for your cow herd to ensure you have a uniform calf crop at weaning time? But you leave the bulls in, and you might get some coverage of some of those late bred cows. Now, those late bred cows, if they don't fit your production criteria, that could be a culling selection point for you, because other producers may be calving at a later season than you, and then you have just now helped supply for their cow herd. Now, if you have a spring and a fall cow calving herd, one thing I don't recommend is shifting your late breds or your open animals into that fall calving herd, because you're just propagating those late bred genetics or maybe some poor reproductive qualities that you may not want to actually propagate in a different calving season herd. So select your calving window, whether that be 21 days, 45, 60 days, 90 days, however you want to do it. But make sure you stick to that breeding and calving window. Because if you start to allow those late breds to continue to propagate in your herd, typically their calves then will also propagate those genetics, and you may tend to see some of those replacement heifers from those late bred cows get bred later as well. One being because at weaning time, those calves are light, so it takes a lot longer for them to reach puberty and reach that critical threshold weight to begin their breeding cycles, and then they begin breeding later into the season. So those are some production issues you can consider. Now, the next is a little bit more difficult to define. We talk about least efficient cows or heifers, but what does that exactly mean? Well, it depends on your production goals. Are you selling calves at weaning, where you're looking more at growth rate between birth weight and weaning? So you want those animals to be more efficient. You want those cows to be able to make an efficient calf. But does that efficiency at the end of the day mean pounds of calf weaned per cow body weight? Or do you mean least efficient, as those cows and calves don't convert forage or feed into pounds of gain? So these are some things you need to consider for efficiency. Typically, I like to look at pounds of calf weaned per cow body weight. So what I'm meaning there is that, do you have a 1,600-pound cow and she has produced a 450-pound calf? We hope that our cows can wean at least 50% of their body weight for their calf. So therefore, she is not meeting that threshold criteria, as an example. Now, you have a 1,300-pound cow, but she weans a 700-pound calf. Now, that is an extremely efficient animal. She has done her job to produce a good calf by weaning time, whether you're selling at weaning or you're trying to develop replacement heifers for your operation. So those are some things to consider for efficiency. Now, that requires the weight of the calves and the weight of the cows. And one thing I like to point out is, if you have the ability to weigh your cows and you have to work them at pre-breeding or pre-weaning, go ahead and grab a weight and a body condition score on those animals as they work through the chute. Determining your body weight of your cow herd by those cows you have weaned, let's say in the fall, because typically they're thinner, they're older, they weigh less than your typical cow in your herd. They were culled for some sort of reason. So if you have the ability to weigh your animals, I usually suggest it a couple of times a year. As you're already working them through a chute, just grab a weight and a body condition score on them. This way, when it comes time to weaning, you can determine how much those animals might need to gain at weaning time, or should those animals be culled because they're a thin animal, they haven't performed well, their calf wasn't very good, and then you can make those decisions. Now, another difficult parameter to define is genetics. What do we need to determine for our genetics? Because there's some different ways to look at it. Do you go with your older genetics, your established herd of cows, or should you look more towards your young animals, which have the newer genetics? You're propagating those, hopefully those established genetics in your herd. Now, when I say old genetics, it becomes difficult because if you have older animals, such as that 10-year-old that produces a good calf every year, those are some genetics you may want to continue on in your herd, especially if she's producing a good replacement heifer every year, or even, somewhat throughout her entire breeding capabilities. Because that animal has lasted in your herd for several years. She has met your breeding potential and your production goals. But if we look at those young animals, those are the younger, more progressive genetics that you're maybe trying to propagate in your herd by purchasing those new bulls and looking more strictly at which EPDs that you're trying to propagate, whether it's growth rate or reproductive capabilities in your replacement heifers. So there's kind of a fine line you need to walk there when determining what type of genetic selection you're going to put on your herd and those animals. Now, another thing to keep in mind is your replacement heifers. As I stated previously, not all heifers are destined for the breeding herd. Some heifers should enter the food chain because they just don't have the genetics for breeding as some of your more superior replacement heifers would. But that doesn't mean that some of those heifers that don't meet your criteria won't meet another producer's criteria. So even if you aren't completely culling all of your heifers, after you've selected your replacements, there may be two additional groups in that culled group. It could be the dry lot heifers that go to the feedlot, or it could be the additional replacement heifers that just didn't meet your criteria that could go and help another producer. So keeping that in mind, there may be some other outlets for those heifers that aren't selected for your herd. Now, one thing to keep in mind with your cull cows is there is a cull cow market, just like there is a cull bull market. But timing of that can determine whether or not you're going to receive a better price for those animals. So typically, we see the cull cow slump between September and about February, because September, October, and November is when preg check is going to occur. So therefore, a lot of cull cows are going to hit the market during that time frame. Usually, the biggest valley here being in about November. But as the chart shows, as you get past January, February, that price starts to climb and levels off. So if you have the capability of keeping your cull cows and holding them till after the first of the year, you can get a better price for those cull cows. Maybe feed them a little bit better, add a little bit of weight to them. And that then can add to an increased revenue for your operation. Now, that's not saying everybody has that capability, so keep that in mind. It is going to cost some money if you wish to put some weight on those cull cows. So if it's a year where maybe you don't have any excess feed available, you may need to sell during this valley portion. But if it's a good year, you have some extra hay available, decent quality hay, and you can keep those cows a little bit longer and add some body weight onto them and body condition, you might be able to receive a better price. So those are some things to think about as you're making your culling decisions. And the reason now that we're going to move into record keeping is because you can't measure what you don't record. So on our beef extension web page here, we do have some printable record sheets that you can use. You can put them in a binder and write the information down to make those culling decisions, or just keeping your herd records in general. And when I say record keeping, it doesn't need to be, just as an example here, this American Angus Association record sheet, it doesn't need to be this fancy. This is for your registered herds where they do require a lot of information. You can use a lined sheet of paper or a notebook. There's the NCBA Red Book that they create where you can keep your herd records, or you can use these Right in the Rain record books as well. It doesn't matter what form you use, whether it's the books or you have just a blank sheet of paper where you write things down. Keeping records is essential to making sure your cow herd is meeting its potential for you. So like I said, you can't measure what you don't record. So write it down, whether that's on one of those, handwritten books or pieces of paper. If you're computer savvy and you want to create a spreadsheet for your herd operation, there are mobile applications out there that you can use to record all of your information as well. There's several other programs. And then keep it in a safe place. If you write everything down with a pen and paper, I would definitely make copies of that, because we all know that, you're out feeding, let's say in the winter time, and you're rolling out those bales, and you get out of the pickup to cut the net wrap off, and you leave the door open, and your sheets blow away in the wind. So I always like to keep extra copies, whether that's in electronic form or in paper form. But keeping it safe is crucial so you can refer back to those documents later as you're trying to make some culling decisions, or just trying to decide which bulls to purchase, or if you're going to purchase some new replacement heifers. So referring back to those records can help you make those decisions. There's several records that you can keep. So production history, write down the calving information on your cows. Um, which a lot of times requires an individual ear tag. So, writing down cows when they calved, what was that calf body weight? What has been their production body weight throughout the year? Were those cows or heifers AI or natural service? When did you perform the AI? When did you put the bulls in? When did you take them out? What types of vaccinations have you used? Have you had to treat of any of your animals for illness? When did you start feeding supplements or putting different mineral out? Keeping a whole herd inventory can help make decisions to improve your herd. Now, and the reason it seems like I really harp on this, write it down, and it can really help with your culling strategy, is if you write next to a cow in the spring about a cow that calved that was going to eat your lunch as soon as you stepped into the pasture or into the pen, depending on where you're calving out, and she immediately tried to eat your lunch, yes, that is a cow that's willing to protect her calf, but no cow is ever worth getting injured or dying over. Safety for you is also key. So if you have cows in there that have bad temperaments, especially at calving, and you write that down in your record book, you can refer back to that in the fall at weaning time. Now, she may produce a really good calf, but at the end of the day, you need to decide, is your safety less important than that good calf? And in my opinion, it is not. Because you might have gotten away from her one time, but she may catch you the next year. So, don't be afraid to cull a cow that produces a good calf because she actually has a bad temperament and is detrimental to your herd, because especially if maybe she has a replacement heifer, those genetics might be propagated in that replacement heifer that you want to keep in your herd, which means her heifer then, or her heifer calf, may also try and eat your lunch in 2 years. So just keep those things in mind as you're writing these things down. Now, some other records you can keep. Just keep a calendar. Some of those books do provide monthly calendars for everything. But just writing things down. Did you treat a calf? Especially for, like, let's say withdrawal dates on some of your drugs that you might have treated for an illness for those calves or those cows or bulls. When did you pour those animals? Because that also contains a withdrawal date. So keeping those things in mind and writing that down can determine when you can sell animals as well. For grazing, when did you move pastures? How long were they in there? What was the production of the pasture when they entered, and what was the production when they left? Or how much did you leave behind? Were you grazing take half, leave half? Were you trying to graze 70% and leaving 30%, depending on the year? Another record to keep is water. So are you taking water quality samples? What was the total dissolved solids? What was the sulfate measurement? Especially knowing what type of water source it is. You can then refer back to this if you start seeing maybe some quality issues. Hay records. So when did you cut your hay? How many bales did you get, or how many tons per the acre? Did you treat any of your fields for pests? Did you fertilize any of your fields? Rainfall records. So you can refer back to these over the years and determine maybe there's a different grazing rotation you could utilize to better um, use your pastures during different times of the year. So there's several records you can keep, and I know it seems overwhelming, but at the end of the day, writing it down and keeping it in a safe place can really help you make these production goal decisions, whether you're selecting an animal to continue on in the herd or if you're going to selectively cull that animal. So with that, that was our culling and record keeping webinar. Thank you for listening and have a great day.